Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. I'm Andrew. Whilst I'm taking a break from my Agile software design series, I felt I needed to put together a standalone video about DesiGen, the design and code generation tool I've put together. And that's what this video is about. This video is intended to be a standalone demonstration of DesiGen. If you've been watching the Agile software design series, then episodes 3, 4 and 5 will have demonstrated the application's capability to you already, so there may be limited value in you watching this video. But if you haven't watched that series, then maybe watch this video first, get an idea for what the application's about, and if it's of interest to you, then you can go back and watch that series. So what we're going to do is put together a little application. And the premise we're going to use for the demo today is that a small animal welfare charity has come to us. They're struggling to manage where they keep their animals, understanding which animal is in which area, and they've asked us for some help. So what we're going to build is a little Blazor WebAssembly application using CSLA. The architecture is sort of irrelevant in the sense that the application, DesiGen, is capable of working with other architectures, but it's kind of valuable, I think, for you to understand the architecture that we're going to be building today, just to give you an understanding of what it is that I'm doing as I go through the demo. So here's a picture of the architecture, just a very kind of simple thing. We're going to build our web user interface layer. That's going to use a Blazor WebAssembly application. Behind that is going to be a UI orchestration layer built using a .NET standard library that's got MVVM models in it. And as a separate assembly, for a reason which is to do with CSLA, we then have our business objects, which are MVVM objects used to perform their work. They're in a separate .NET standard assembly. All of that is hosted by a web host so that it's available over the internet. That's going to be an ASP.NET Core server project. And behind that sits the same assembly as the one that sits in the Blazor WebAssembly application. And at the bottom of it all, but you'll notice the direction of the arrows, the data access library, the implementation of a repository is going to be built as a separate assembly. And that inversion ensures that we can't accidentally reference a specific data access implementation from our business object library, and that's how it can function on both the on the client side and the server side. Down at the bottom we've got a data storage layer. I'm just going to use SQL Server for that. So we're sort of building two little applications here. There's the WebAssembly thing, and then there's the host for the WebAssembly application, and some CSLA magic makes them sort of glue together. So as I mentioned, this is just an example really of what you can achieve. DesiGen is capable of doing any architecture and any language, so don't worry about the fact that Blazor's no use to you, or you don't want to do CSLA, or you don't use SQL Server. That's not really relevant. It's more about the capabilities of what the application can do that we're going to demonstrate. The point is that if yours doesn't match what this is, then you would be creating your own templates, but that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to do that in a different video just to show you how to do that. But the idea is generally that you would export an existing template just because that kind of gives you a starting point for doing it, and then use that template as a guide to create your own. Okay, so let's dive in and have a look at the application. Okay, so here is DesiGen. As I say, it's a design and code generation tool. So what we're going to do is create a design and then code generate the results from it. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a new design. This is our home screen, so these buttons are highly available to us. We'll click Create New Design. and I'll choose a system under which the design resides. Systems exist just so that there's some categorization so that you can find things more easily if you work on multiple systems, although you also choose a coding standard against a system, so you can have different coding standards for different systems if you want. So I'm going to create a design called animal management. Now I'm going to give it a strange name, blank template. That's because if I was going to do this repeatedly, what I'd do is I'd use this design as the starting point for each subsequent development task. So we create a design there. So we got the opportunity to just remind ourselves what our requirements are within the design. That's just a reference to what it is we're working on. So normally we'd have a task for this in a task management system, and we'd simply put in the reference to a task within Jira or whatever it is we're using. I'm just going to paste a bit of text in, and the point is that we're just going to create a small application. I've already told you about this, but we're going to do two tasks here. Normally I would do these separately if this was the real world. We would create the sort of application structure as one step and then check that into source control, and then maybe create the add, edit and delete capability for animals as a separate step. That's just so that your team can start working on their tasks more quickly, really, is why I would do it separately. We're going to do both today together. Okay, so what we get the opportunity to do is create data structures. That's just a collection of sort of properties of bits of information that go together that might be used for something within the application. I'm going to choose to create it based upon a template. Those templates are editable, by the way, so you can create your own. But what this does is it sort of helps me with creating something with the naming convention that I prefer. As I say, the naming convention is editable. I choose to have the name of the table within my field names very often. Not always, obviously, but for the ID and the name, that can be a handy thing to differentiate within queries and things. So I tend to keep them included in there, but you don't have to. Just change the naming convention within the data structure templates within the templates area. So it's created two fields for us, and I'm going to add a third called location ref, which is going to be like a reference string to the location in which the animal resides, and that's gone down the bottom there. Now we've got this ticked here, include audit fields, so it will actually add some audit fields automatically to this for us when we make use of this data structure, so that we don't have to specify those each time. Again, those come from a template, a data structure template, so you can change what those are. And that's the only data structure we need. Now what we need to do is create ourselves a skeleton solution. So we scroll down in our solutions list until in our templates list until we find the solutions set. And in CSLA version 6, I'm going to choose Blazor WebAssembly hosted solution using CSLA. And I'm going to enter the name of it. Oh, apologies for the clicky keyboard, by the way. You may have seen that I was having trouble with the keyboard that I was using in previous demos. It was soft and horrible, so I bought myself a new one. So I'm going to call the solution name Animal Management, and I'm going to put it in ctemp demo Animal Management on this machine. And so it's going to walk me through the bits that it's going to create. This is really just to sort of help me rename them if I want to. I'm not going to. I'm going to use all the defaults here. So there shouldn't be anything that I need to do to change, but these screens are custom in the sense that they're customized to the things that are being added. And it's asking me questions, but it just so happens that I know that the answers are all as I need them. So I don't need to customize anything. Again, if you create your own templates, then you can have all the answers pre-populated with the things that make most sense in your environment. So what that's done is created a bunch of artifacts. Artifacts are the sort of output from the solution, from the design, if you like. So we've created multiple projects there which match the diagram that we showed earlier, and a little bit of glue code and kind of configuration and things, which make sure that that all works together. So at this point, that is all of the artifacts that we would need if we were just doing the solution on its own and then checking it into source control. But I'm going to go a stage further, and I'm going to also add the add, edit, delete feature. So the way I'm going to do that is using separate little pieces of functionality that exist in other templates. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my CSLA objects. This won't make much sense to you if you don't use CSLA, but don't worry, these are like models basically. What I want is an editable root, a read-only root list, and a read-only child for CSLA 6. It's going to ask me what data structure they're based on and where I want to put them, and I'm going to put them in the objects project. And again, it's going to ask me some questions about those things that I'm creating. I will change these a little bit. So what I'm going to do is change the authorization rules just so that all the authorization works. I'm also going to change the name of the editable object to animal edit to demonstrate that it's going to be used within an edit screen. The read-only list, all I need to do with that is change the authorization again for the reason I just mentioned, and the read-only child is fine as it is. So that's our models defined within our design. So what we need to do next is we need some way of interacting with a data store. So I'm going to use a repository design pattern. And for my implementation of my repository, I'm going to use stored procedures, which may seem a bit old-fashioned, but it's actually being done on purpose. This is to do with the principle of least privilege, which I've just done a video about. And it also demonstrates that you don't need to be quite so scared about SQL as maybe you have been in the past if you're following this sort of process. So .NET 6 Transact SQL. I'm going to use a repository using stored procedures. It's going to create all the SQL objects for me, the interface, which is like the contract of the repository, and the data transfer object, which represents the data that needs to be moved around. So as I go through this, I'll just highlight here. This is what I'm looking at. It's asking me for each bit that we're adding, because we're adding multiple bits here. For each set of things that I'm adding, it's asking me where I want to put them. So the repository interface, I'm going to put within the objects project, but I'm going to put it in a subfolder called data contracts just to separate it out. Now I put it on purpose within the objects project, and that's because it's going to enforce the inversion of the reference between the objects project and the data access project. But those are going to be based upon the animal data structure. The repository implementation, that's like the code that actually does it rather than just the definition of what it might be like. That's going to go in the project called data access. The SQL stored procedures that I'm creating are going to go in this data storage project within a folder called stored procedures. The SQL table is going to go in the tables folder, again within data storage. And so then it's going to show me some stuff about what I'm going to create. Now, it doesn't have to show me this, by the way. This is part of the way the templates are set up so that I can change things. But I generally am not going to need to change very much. And this stuff, other than entering a database name, doesn't need to change very much. And all my stored procedures can just go in as they are. If you're creating a child object, you may not need one of the stored procedures, which is why it's asking you if you want all of them. You can skip them if you don't want them. And the table we're also going to create. So that's the definition of how our stored procedures and our table would be, and the implementation of the repository, as well as the contract that it needs to fulfill. Those have all been defined. So we've done our object layer, we've done all the sort of data access related stuff. So the bit left on the diagram will be a bit of user interface. And for our user interface, we're going to use Blazor, and we've got this thing here under Blazor CSLA v6, manage, list and edit components. So those are going to be my Blazor components. It's also going to create the view model for me, and it's even going to create a test a set of tests, your set of unit tests that would test the view model for me. So again, it's going to ask me where I want to put things. Where do I want to put the Blazor components? Well, I could separate those out into a separate Razor class library, but for ease, I'm going to put them within the WebAssembly project themselves in the components folder. And again, those are based on the animal data structure that we created. So the view model is next. Where is the view model going to go? Well, so the view model is going to go in a project called UI control. I'm separating that out so that it makes it easier to test, for one thing, and it enforces our architecture a little bit. You could put it within your WebAssembly if you wanted to, but I'm separating it out. So that's where I'm going to put that. And the tests for the view model, where do I want those to go? Well, I've got a unit tests project down the bottom here. Again, you could call that test or tests if you wanted to, but I've chosen to call it unit tests to make it clear that they're unit rather than integration tests. And that's where that's going to go. And again, it's going to ask me a couple of questions. Now, the authorization, as I've mentioned, I'm just going to change it to users. What I tend to do with my code generation or with my design templates is I suggest more secure things, and then you can back off the security a bit. So by default, the authorization is not to allow all users to do things on the assumption that you may do things which are not appropriate to users within your application. So in the list component, it's going to ask me some type names. If you remember, I changed the name of the editable object to animal edit. So I just need to tell it that as part of that change. And the edit component doesn't need any customization, but the view model also needs to know the name of that type that we created, animal edit. So I'll just enter that. And new in CSLA 6, the data portal, people who know CSLA might recognize this. The data portal is no longer a static class like it used to be. And that means that we need DI objects to be injected into things in order to be able to access the data portal. And we're using like factory classes in order to do that. I've chosen to call them the name of the type followed by factory. It's actually a nested class the way I'm doing it. That just makes some of the scoping a little bit easier, but you can make them separate if you want. That's what I've done in my template. So I just need to update that one again because I chose to call it animal edit, but everything else is okay. So that's added all of those artifacts. So we've done our user interface, we've done our models or our object layer, if you like. We've got a view model that we added there. We've done our data access. So that's all of our artifacts added to our design. The next bit of our design is to add references to other documents. So I could add in a reference to like a requirements document, if such a thing exists, or an architecture document explaining the sort of high-level architecture. I could add a reference to the diagram, for example, that I showed you, which just gave you an indication of the architecture that we're building, but I'm just going to skip that. So the next question I get asked is about authentication. I just need to think, as part of a design task, am I doing anything which is potentially risky from the authentication perspective? I'm asked to make a declaration about that. I'll just copy in a bit of text there that explains that for a demo application, the demo application comes with a fake authentication mechanism. It is fake and we should not use it in production. And for the next step is authorization. Authorization is asking me the same thing. Is there anything being changed which makes this development task particularly risky? And it's sort of risky in the sense that, again, the authentication mechanism is fake. The role-based authorization stuff that we've been doing, where we've been changing the role name from managers to users, that actually works if the authentication mechanism is real. The fact that the authentication mechanism is fake means that we're sort of testing it, but we're sort of not, because we're not logging in as a different user type. So I've made a statement there about authorization. Normally your statements would be shorter than that. I'm having to keep them quite long because it's a demo application and there's this fake stuff in there. So it'd be very common for you to just say no changes required. So the next bit is a small risk declaration. This is asking me to step back from my design and say, based on the design that I've done and all the artifacts that I've come up with and all the requirements that we've been thinking about as we've gone through this, is there anything risky in what we're doing here that needs to be considered separately? We have a list of suggestions here. This is like a list of common things, particularly if you know the OWASP top 10, you might recognize a number of these things. Now, there are a couple of things within this demo which are a bit risky, like the fact that the authentication is fake. So we have a potential risk of authentication bypass. And within my application, I have already set up a potential mitigation of I'm not going to do anything about this. Now, you wouldn't get this out of the box, but again, this is all editable. So if you wanted to add extra potential mitigations like I don't care, you could put in the text that says I don't care automatically. Or when you, if you don't tick any of the things at the bottom, you just get an empty box at the bottom of the screen here, which you could type some stuff into if you wanted. But I get all the text automatically here. So that's authentication bypass, that's mentioned. The other thing that I'm not really doing anything about as part of the demo is there's not much by way of exception handling within the default application. The way people handle exceptions is custom to them, in the sense that what you probably ought to do is add a bunch of logging somewhere that gets recorded into a data store, a database, into your cloud logging mechanism, whatever it is. That varies by scenario, really. So for demos, I don't add one. But for your templates, you would want to add some form of logging. So I just mention that I've not done anything about it and mention that as a risk. And I say in the mitigation strategy, I don't need to mitigate this because it's a demo. But if it wasn't a demo, I might need to think about what the mitigation would be. Is there something that I need to do? Is there some extra work that I need to do as part of my development in order to minimize the risk as a result of the development that's being done? So the next section is security categorization. Now, what this is saying is, based upon all the security related stuff that I've just thought about, the authentication, the authorization, whether they're being changed, and the risks that we identified, what is the overall categorization of the level of danger of this piece of development? And is there any sort of process related stuff that we ought to do in order to mitigate the risks that we identified? So, for example, it might be that we're required to do a penetration test because of the particular types of changes that we need to make. Or it might be that within your team, you have a hierarchy of mitigations based upon risk. So if there's little risk, then nothing needs to happen. If there's some risk, then maybe a senior developer needs to do a code review once we've done the development. And maybe if it's very risky, then someone with the most knowledge of security risks ought to review it, like an architect or a security specialist. In this particular case, because this is demo code, we don't really need to do anything special in this case. And the last thing to do is to think about data retention. Now, there's two reasons for thinking about data retention as part of doing design. The first is GDPR. If we're capturing personally identifiable information, then GDPR or equivalent legislation in whatever part of the world you're in requires us to think about how long we need to keep it for and what happens to it in order to make sure that it doesn't exist in our systems indefinitely, which is inappropriate for personally identifiable information. So that's one reason for thinking about it, but it's not the only one. In fact, when we build a system, ideally we want to build it in such a way that it's going to work indefinitely, and that we don't really have to think about the fact that eventually it might get full of data. We might have used up all the electrons in the world and our database will fall over. So that's the other reason for thinking about data retention. Is there any transactional data that we can delete because we don't need it after a certain point in the process? Well, this is a demo, so there is no data retention policy defined, and it's okay for it not to be defined to begin with anyway. But what we might do here is say we haven't defined it yet, but here is the task number of the task which we have put into our task management system in order to remind us at a later date that we do need to start deleting some transactional data after a while. Here, all I'm saying is, because it's a demo, I'm just going to delete the database really once the demo is complete. Okay, so that's the design complete. If we want to at this point, we can output that to a document. That would give us the ability to show that we did a design, that we took some decisions, that those decisions were considered, and that we can evidence that we did that process. So you would save that document off to a place on your network if that was useful to you. You don't have to create the document if you don't want to, but it's there if you do. So this is at a status which does not currently allow me to do code generation, as it says here. Code generation is not enabled at this status. Now again, all the status stuff you can configure as part of the application. So if you want to be able to be ready to do code generation from the outset without even thinking about it, you can edit the statuses that already exist and say, when it's at this status, just let me do code generation. I haven't done that. What I've done is I've left it in the default, and that's to show you that it is possible to have a little workflow here if you need it. If you do design reviews, if that's considered important or beneficial within your team, then what you can do is mark it as ready for review, and someone would be able to find that in the list screen based upon its status and go, oh yeah, here's the one I need to do a review on. I don't need to go searching for it because it's marked as ready for review, and very little else would be. However, there's not going to be no design review on this. I'm just going to go straight to ready to develop, and what that does is enable the generate code button, and I can now click that button and it will go away and generate a bunch of artifacts for me. So it's created a bunch of files on disk for me to look at. So that is the design complete. Okay, so that's the demo done of what the application is capable of doing. There is a bit of coding to be done after the generation has been completed in order to get it up to the point where it's a working application. Generally, that's around 10 to 15 minutes for this particular demo. I'm not going to show that here for brevity. The video is long enough as it is. Most of the code needs doing because we've created a new solution from scratch. If you're adding to an existing solution, then you don't need to do anywhere near as much coding as that. The amount of coding you do is dependent upon your templates. The built-in ones offer some flexibility which your own templates won't necessarily need to provide. There are other videos on the channel showing the coding if you're interested. There is also a demo showing more specialized templates, which is an example of how fast we can go if we make some more decisions up front than I make with the built-in templates. If you're interested in more information on that, check out episodes 4 and 5 of the Agile Software Design series on this channel for those videos. So the benefits, what have we achieved by using this tool today? Well, firstly, we use code generation. Code generation is faster than writing code by hand, and it's often better quality because we don't have human error taking place as part of the process. If we spend time on making sure our templates are very good quality, we can then reap the rewards of those templates by reusing them. We also thought up front before we started development about what we were going to do as part of the development task, and that should make your development smoother and easier. We also followed a secure development lifecycle. We were reminded by the tool as we went through to consider security as part of the development process. Remember, DesiGen is capable of being used to develop any architecture, technology or language. You just need to create your own templates. You can use the built-in ones as your guide. Why not try this for yourself? Go to getdesigning.dotnotstandard.com for more information about the process. From there, follow the links to the docs site for the tool, from where you can download it and try it for yourself. There will be other videos on DesiGen, so stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll join me again soon.